Well, hello, Geneva. Welcome another Friday edition of Testimonies. Today, I want to start with a quick announcement. You guys know we end every school year with My Generation Night or MGN. This year, we're going digital. So here's what we need from you. We want you to put together a music video of yourself playing a song from your generation and submit it by Monday to be put together for our MGN virtual edition that will go live on May 1st, next Friday, at 8 p.m. So do that. I sent an email out on Tuesday. Check the email for all the links for submissions, and we can't wait to see the talent that you come up with for our first ever digital MGN. Well, here we are again, another Friday, another exciting edition of Testimonies. And I've got two wonderful people with us today. First, you'll hear from Chris Mathews. He's our Director of Sports Information on campus. And you'll hear from Dr. Lynda Szabo as well. We are excited to have Chris with us. Chris, we've been kind of going through a series of God's faithfulness in times of trial, and I'd love to hear just the ways you've seen God's faithfulness throughout your life.
Yeah, I've watched all the previous Friday editions you've done and have been really encouraged by them. So I'm glad to be a part of this and to share a little bit, particularly over the last couple of years, how the Lord has walked with me through some difficult challenges. Just as a little bit of quick background, I graduated from Geneva in 2000, had 4 wonderful years here, met my wife here. And shortly after I graduated, I started to have a desire to be back at the college in some full-time capacity, though I didn't quite know how that would come about. And in God's timing, it took about 17 years. But in the fall of 2017, I was hired on as the Director of Sports Information. And about the following summer, about 10 months after that, my wife and 5 children who were living down in Pittsburgh at that time bought a house up here in College Hill, and we moved up here. And I remember thinking life is really good. I'm where I'd wanted to be for a while. Sort of getting settled in and reconnected with the community up here that we had, my wife and I had enjoyed for 4 years. And then in the fall of 2018, in October, I started to have some significant health issues, some mainly centered around my digestive system. And I turned 40 earlier that year and had never had any health issues whatsoever up until that point. And so I considered myself a fairly healthy person. And so I just ignored it for a little while. The fall is a busy sports season for us in athletics. And so I had a lot to do. And so I just tried to fight my way through it. But after about 8 or 9 days, I was losing that battle and decided I probably should go seek some medical attention. And when I got to the hospital, they looked at me and they said, "You're in pretty rough shape. We need to hospitalize you and figure out what's going on." So I had some scans done, and they came back and said, "We think that you've developed some sort of chronic digestive disorder, whether that's Crohn's or colitis." They weren't quite sure, but some sort of variation of that. And they said that there's no cure for it. There are meds to help you manage it, potentially surgeries you can have, but it's something that you'll probably have to live with for the rest of your life, which was hard news to hear, someone who considered myself a fairly healthy person. And then they said, on top of that, we found a small growth on one of your kidneys. We're not quite sure what that is, but while you're here, we want to make sure we get that checked out. So the next day I met with a kidney doctor, and he looked at the scans. He said, I can't tell for sure if this is cancerous or not, but statistically speaking, upwards of 90% of these types of growths are cancerous. And so a day after hearing I probably had a chronic condition, hearing that I probably had cancer as well was a lot to process all at once. The kidney doctor did follow that up by saying the growth is really small. In fact, if it had been any smaller, we wouldn't have caught it on the scans. And so because of that, we should be able to go and cut it out. We cut a small part of your kidney. And for most people, that's curative, if in fact it does prove to be cancerous. But still, that was a lot to process all in a short amount of time. And there are a couple of things that stand out to me about my week in the hospital. The first one was that night. I was by myself in the hospital room, and I remember just having this overwhelming sense that the Lord was in control, that I needed to trust the Lord, that I could trust the Lord, even though things seemed to be completely out of control at that moment. And then the following day, I was going in for some more tests from the GI doctor, and he was in the process of hooking me up. He was going to put me under for those tests, and he asked me, "What's the latest on your kidney situation?" And so I had explained what the kidney doctor had told me the day before, that that it probably, the statistically would be a high percentage to be cancer, but because it was caught so early, the prognosis was quite good. And I remember he was an older Italian doctor. I don't have any reason to believe that he was a believer, but he looked at me kind of in this sternly doctorly sort of sense and said, "You need to know how lucky you are." And then kind of in a sort of a mystical way, he kind of looked up at the ceiling and said, "Somebody up there is clearly looking out for you." And I remember that because at the time, I wasn't necessarily feeling like I was seeing God's hand in the situation, but he was an unbelieving medical doctor, an expert, that was acknowledging to me that he could see the hand of God in the situation. So that always stuck with me a little bit. It took about a week before I was well enough to go home from the digestive issues that I was having, although it really took 2 or 3 months to get back to full strength. Because I had lost about 30 pounds during that ordeal. And a couple of weeks later, I went back in to have some focused tests on the kidney itself. And I followed back up a few days later with the kidney doctor, who said, we didn't see any signs that it was cancerous. And I thought, wow, that's awesome. But he said, the scans and tests we did they can conclusively say that it is cancer, but they can't necessarily conclusively say that it's not. And so he said, because you're young, I don't want to just leave it at that. And so my wife and I kind of discussed things. I had already come into that meeting assuming to hear that, well, you need to have cancer. We need to get this out. So my wife decided, let's go ahead and just have the surgery, get it out. Hopefully it's benign, move on from there, and put that behind me. So in January 2019, I went in for surgery. They removed the growth along with a small part of my kidney. And by all accounts, the surgery went well. They sent that growth off for biopsy, and it did actually come back positive for cancer. So that was, after sort of the low of hearing it probably was, and then hearing it probably wasn't, then hearing that it was again a hard bit of news to hear. Even with a good prognosis, cancer is not something that you want associated with your medical history, but it now was, along with the chronic digestive condition. So that was a little over a year ago. And the last year has certainly been one of a lot of learning and trusting in the Lord. I'm in a pretty good place right now with my health. By God's grace, the digestive condition, I've gone on meds, and that has helped to maintain it quite well, much better than the 2 GI doctors that I worked with initially thought that I would probably have a more severe case of it because of how severe my first flare-up was, and that it will be harder to manage. By God's grace, that has not been the case to this point. And then I have scans every 6 months on my kidney just to make sure nothing reoccurs for that. Even with a good prognosis, those are still kind of nervous times. I actually have another scan coming up in a few days. It's just part of the regular schedule with that. And so certainly the Lord has taught me a lot over the past year and a half. I wish that I was a little bit of a quicker learner at times. It's easy to trust the Lord when things are good. It's a little more of a challenge, at least for me, to keep that same trust in place when things are seemingly going out of control around you and you're going through some hard situations. But it was a reminder to me that this body is going to fail me eventually, whether that's a year down the road, whether that's 50 years down the road. Our bodies all will fail us eventually, no matter how healthy we try to keep them. And I'm seeing evidences already of my body starting to fail me. And so, I've been blessed with a wonderful, godly family that I grew up in, a wonderful wife, 5 children that I love, work that I love. And as good as those things are, it's a reminder to me that this is just sort of a temporary stopping place for me on this earth, that my home is with the Lord in heaven. And so trying to learn to be like the psalmist, and I think it's 112, he has no fear of bad news, because the psalmist is so sort of focused on the Lord, trying to emulate that, knowing that no matter what happens in the future, I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but the Lord does. Not only does he know, he's in control of it. And so whether that means good things or hard things, these health issues, I know were ordained by the Lord for my own good and for his glory. And so trusting that no matter what tomorrow brings, the Lord will be with me and sustain me through those things, not only in this life, but in the life to come.
Chris, thank you so much for sharing that with us today. I think what a good reminder that our lives are tied, not just about now, but for eternity with Christ, and our bodies will see decay, but Christ will always be with us. And so I'm thankful for your story, for you kind of reminding us of God's faithfulness, and thanks for being willing to share with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Randon.
Our second testimony today comes from Dr. Szabo. She's a professor of English and humanities at Geneva, and we're just grateful to have her with us today. Dr. Szabo, could you share with us just how you've seen God's faithfulness?
Well, God has been so remarkably faithful and loving in my life. I have certainly had times in my life where I've gone through the deep waters, where I have felt nearly overwhelmed. And I have the advantage, I think, of looking back on many decades of God bringing me through those times. And I'll tell you about one, actually, from my childhood. And when I was 10 and my brother was 6, our father left our family. I remember the day vividly when he just walked out, and he left my brother and I with my mom, kind of alone and almost destitute. And at the time, I wasn't as aware of some of the issues that my mom had to confront. But looking back on the time, I can see how faithful God was to us. He provided my mom with a job. She had to raise us as a single mom. We had enough to eat. We had a place to live, and God provided for our physical needs through that experience. And additionally, he provided tender spiritual care, because my mom was and still is a faithful woman of God. And so she raised us through that difficult time. And looking back, I can see how God provided friends and resources for us, sustained my mom, sustained my brother and I through that time. And I would say that God has been so amazing in my life. It's not that I've always had enough. I've had more than enough. I'll tell you another time, maybe 10 years after my dad left. It was about the time that I would be graduating from high school and thinking about going away to school, but we were still, financially challenged. There really wasn't any money. But I had a Sunday school teacher at First Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh, and he's someone that many people at Geneva would know, Andy Marcinko. Andy was a longtime trustee of the college. And I just remember one day him talking to me about Geneva, and that started me thinking about a dream to go to college. And God provided the resources for me to go. Andy's faithfulness as a Sunday school teacher, telling me about the school. I was able to visit Geneva, fell in love with Geneva, and ended up enrolling at the school, and God provided for my financial needs at Geneva. And I would say Geneva has been one of the great provisions in my life. When I was finishing my PhD, once again, had no idea what I was going to be doing with my degree, whether I'd ever find a job teaching. And I would say, out of the blue, I got a call, but I know it wasn't out of the blue. I know that God was leading the department chair at the time, Dr. Paul Smith. He called me and said, how would you like to come and teach at Geneva for a year? Of course, I said yes. And it's been almost 25 years that I've been here. So God has been faithful and more than faithful in blessing my life and sustaining me with jobs and friends and just abundant blessings through the time. So looking back, I can see how well I was cared for. And so that gives me confidence now. Anytime I walk through other dark times or face big challenges, that God is still working. I know he's there. What I've been sort of leaning into in my life, I'd say maybe within the last decade, is God's call for me to be still and to know him, to sort of have this quiet interior where I can hear him speaking and I can see him working in my life. And so Psalm 62 has been very important to me in the past decade of my life, where God tells us, and I'll just read a few verses from the Psalm because they've helped me, and the Psalms, in fact, have helped me in times of great crisis, where I can cling to them and pray them, even if I don't have words. The Psalms are the words. But Psalm 62 says, "For God alone my soul in silence waits. From him comes my salvation. He truly is my strength and my salvation. He is my defense, so that I shall not be greatly shaken." And so I cling to that. God's, he's there, and I need to wait in silence. And then at the end of the Psalm, these verses just always are amazing to me. It says this: "One thing God has spoken, two things have I heard." And I love that, that there's always more. Like he speaks and you hear two things. So, and here's what you hear, and this is what I've heard: that you, O God, are strong, and that you, O Lord, are loving. And when I reflect back on that, those are the qualities of a good father. While I didn't have that in my earthly father, I do have it in my heavenly Father. And so as I think about my life and what God has worked in it, it truly is just amazing. I'm so blessed, and can hardly believe that he's that gracious to me and has given me more than I even asked for. So yep.
I'm like struck while you're speaking, and just the multitude of the way God's faithfulness kind of shows itself, like sometimes through provision, sometimes through presence, sometimes through strength, sometimes just through the tenderness and love that you spoke about. And it is interesting that, you know, God is such this loving father who desires relationship, and because of that, his faithfulness is always going to look in a multitude of ways. And so I think that's really fascinating.
Yes, he gave me what I should have had from my earthly father. I found in my heavenly Father, and sometimes he sends people, which is one of the things I've been struck by, who care for you, like the department chair who called me and said, "You want a job at Geneva?" Or, you know, professors at Geneva that I've had, good faithful friends who sort of can put their physical arms around me and help befriend me. So it's amazing.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I just want to thank you, Dr. Szabo. Thank you for joining us today and sharing a little bit of your story with us. This has been just so fun for me to listen and to learn and to just get to know the stories of Geneva and the people of Geneva even more, and know that the same God who knows what I'm going through knows all of us and is with all of us right now. So, thank you.
Thank you.